talking about convictions and how they've changed my life. And what inspired me to do this talk is um, reading reading articles about my university's Christian college-wide Christian union online, and I came across a lot of negative experience. People were talking about their negative experiences with the Christian Union and how they didn't feel accepted and included because their values didn't align with the Christian Union's values. Like, to them, it was too conservative, whereas people think that it should be more representative of all denominations of Christianity. So it reminded me about how God has given me convictions right when right after I became right after I became Christian, and how I dealt with that, because um, a lot of the convictions had to do with my, I guess, political values, which have a lot of gray areas, and it can be a hard topic to talk about to people in this generation, especially around my age, around that type. Okay. So I'm gonna briefly talk about my experiences with convictions, and the one thing that really surprised me is how seamless they came, which also aligns with my other experiences with God and how He works. Like, it's really gentle and it's really seamless and it's always through you, rather than Him placing something that's like separate from you. He always uses you and also other Christians to work for Him. Yeah. And one day I woke up and I just realized that in my heart I knew that what God was saying in His Word about certain topics to be true, and what I thought was not not godly at all. Yeah. And the funny thing about that is that it didn't take reading like tons of books or going to a bunch of sermons for anyone to convince me of it. Whereas for my older political views, it was like constantly educating myself and constantly reading up on it so that I can build onto my existing values. Another important thing that I realized about convictions is that it's a very personal journey. So not everyone receives the same convictions, which can partly explain why not all Christians live the same lifestyle or agree with each other or vote for the same political parties and etc. So that's really important to keep in mind when I talk to other people about my convictions, is that I made sure that they knew that it was something personal to me and that God revealed to me at the right time. Okay, so how they've changed my life. Knowing God and being saved is obviously the best thing that has happened and will ever happen in my life. But in the case of convictions, I found that the biggest change that they've made was to my relationship and how I interacted with people. I'm going to talk about mistakes I've made when I've received my convictions as a new Christian, which, I hope no one would make the same mistake as I did, is that I immediately started talking about it with other non-Christians. And for some reason, I just thought that it was a good idea and that I had to do it when I preach the gospel, that I had to mention every topic that God brought before me, even though it was personal. I thought that, okay, if I'm not doing this, I will be lying in some way or being dishonest to them. But actually, all of that resulted to was a lot of awkward silences and me just not being able to answer any questions besides the sentence, "Those were just convictions God has given to me," which obviously didn't make a lot of sense to a non-Christian who didn't know God and don't have Him in their life yet. And This was especially important because I used to base a big part of my identity and my friendship on political opinions. So when after I received my convictions, I found myself suddenly being very quiet during those discussions because I was afraid of offending someone or betraying my faith. So I thought the only option was just to not mention it at all. And as a result of this, I found that some of my friendships became less strong because, well, I based them on the defining their defining factor before was those political values. So now we just didn't have much to talk about anymore. And during these times, God really encouraged me with the verse John 15:18. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. So yeah, he brought me back to this verse every time I felt confused or discouraged. And because of that, I knew that regardless of the consequences in my social life and how other people viewed me, I knew for a fact that God would not want me to hide or lie about my convictions, but just approach it in a different way. So I thought more about how I could handle it better. And there are two things that really helped me. The first is how my Christian friends treated me before I was a believer. And the second is looking at how Jesus treated sinners and non-believers in the Bible. So two I have 2 points that I guess they're more practical points that helped me in dealing with those interactions. And the first is to focus on God's love for all sinners. So instead of not contributing to the discussion at all, I would strongly emphasize the aspects that I did agree on, which was God's love. We all know that all people should be equally treated with love and forgiveness. So I would bring my focus and even try to emphasize the parts of the conversations that involved people being discriminated or treated with hate or violence just because of who they are and their identity. So because after all, we're all sinners, so we're all on the same boat and we can't really have judgment on other people. Jesus treated women, the poor, the unclean, oppressors, and racial enemies like they were family, even though they were considered outcasts back then. Obviously, the social context has changed, and now it's different groups of people and different parts of their identity are emphasized. But I'm sure that if Jesus came down in our generation, he would do the exact same thing. Because he approached them with love first and foremost, they became more open-minded to giving their life to God, and that, and as a consequence of that, they would be able to experience convictions in their own time. Because without the context of God's love, nothing would make sense. No matter how much you remind them that it's a sin, or how much you talk to them about hell or eternal damnation, it to them they're not losing anything because they don't understand what losing God's love even means. So I try to not only apply this to my daily conversations um, by bringing my focus onto love and justice, but also by changing the foundation of my friendship to becoming more God-centered. This means not only sharing more about my personal experience with God, but also by strengthening my relationship through other aspects, like spreading joy and supporting them more when they need me. And the second point, the second thing that helped me is becoming a living testimony. Obviously, I don't consider myself a living testimony that's perfect in any means, but this is really important to me to remember, because that's actually how I started being drawn to Christ. It's not reading, it wasn't reading the Bible or being told by other people that I'm a sinner, but actually just looking at how other Christians lived and how much joy they had in their life. Yeah, I used to not be able to understand how on earth they could do that, because they were just so different to everyone else, because God has separated Christians from the world through sanctification. So God reminded me of this verse from Ephesians 3:10. His intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. And I was really drawn to the phrase through the church, because God reminded me that he only wants his will to be done. He wants his will to be done first and foremost through his followers and through how united the church is. Yeah. So that really encouraged me to, instead of focusing on other people's sins, I should instead build my relationship with God so that he can purify and sanctify me more and more, so that when others looked at me, looked at us, they would wonder, what is it that that gives her so much peace and so much joy? Yeah. So today's political environment is largely defined by justice and freedom for all groups of people. And it's really saddening to see how other people view Christianity as the opposite of that. They view Christianity as being restrictive, oppressive, as stripping away their 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 rights and their freedoms to be whoever they want to be. And that is not biblical at all. I mean, Christianity historically has just been so freeing to so many groups of oppressed people. And of course, it's hard to see that because the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So when the context is unrelated, um, people might not be able to see how that can apply to a more modern context. And of course, as Christians, we shouldn't twist God's word to our liking or ignore the harder parts of Christianity. But it's actually a really fine balance that we need to try and achieve, because God treasures every living soul so much that he would want the gospel to be treated in a way that to be preached in a way that lets each person know that what they're missing can be found in him. And every individual God built every individual differently, and the whole in every individual can be filled differently. So we can't, it's difficult to assume that what we need from God is the same as what other people are needing from God right now. So I think it's important for us to think about how we can preach the gospel in a way that appeals to a different generation. This generation is really convinced that their joy comes from personal identity and personal will. But as Christians, we have responsibility, and we have the joy to reveal how freedom can only be found by basing our identity through God and following his will. Yes. Thank you for listening.